Welcome to the very first episode of First Fuel, a fortnightly podcast bringing you perspectives on the role of energy efficiency, energy management and demand response in the energy transition playing out here in Australia and around the world. I'm Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council. I'm delighted to be joined for episode 1 of First Fuel by ClimateWorks CEO Anna Skarbek. Anna is here to discuss ClimateWorks' seminal new report, I think we're calling it Anna, Decarbonisation Futures, and the role of the demand side in the economic recovery on the other side of this crisis. Hello, Anna.
Hello, Luke.
So, Anna, you've done a bunch of things over the course of your storied career, investment banker, board member, I think, of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. You were a founding board member, right?
Yes.
And of course, you've just clocked up 10 years as the founding CEO of ClimateWorks Australia. Do you want to give us the elevator pitch on ClimateWorks for listeners who maybe are aware of your organisations but are a bit vague on the details?
Yes, happy to. ClimateWorks works within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and we were set up in partnership with philanthropy through the Maya Foundation to be a bridge between research and action, in recognition that there is a lot of great technical knowledge around climate solutions, but it's not always in the hands of the decision makers who need to act. And so we work closely with business and government to present a lot of that information about climate solutions in frameworks and actionable advice that business and government can take forward. And we specialise now in pathways to net zero emissions.
I was actually wondering about that, given the recent 10-year anniversary and the fact you've been there that whole time, you're the founding CEO of ClimateWorks. How has the remit of ClimateWorks evolved? Are you doing exactly what you expected to be doing 10 years ago, or has it shifted a little bit over time?
You know, we are doing exactly the mission we were set 10 years ago. It's a credit to the co-founders at the Maya Foundation and Monash. Also, the mission is perhaps life's work. Back then, the language was catalyse substantial emissions reductions in the next 5 years. That was the initial, and now we're 10 years in. It's still the same task, catalyse the substantial emission reductions. And so some of the language has evolved, and the Paris Agreement was ratified during that time. And now we understand net zero emissions as the goal rather than, say, incremental emissions improvements. But the task and the gap in the market, if you like, which is to get the solutions and frameworks and advice in the hands of the decision makers who can and must act, is still a gap, even though the sector is bigger now. There are more solutions providers, yet still there is a gap in terms of policy and corporate leadership. There are great leaders, but it's not widespread, as we know. So the work continues.
And as a casual observer, an interested observer, I suppose, of ClimateWorks and your work over the years, is it fair to say that over the last 5 years you've ramped up your engagement with the corporate sector, or had the resources or ability to ramp up engagement, or has that been there from the beginning?
It's always been there, but the corporate sector itself has ramped up. I think that's what's changed. We worked with corporates right at the beginning of our decade. We worked with the big four banks. We worked with the industry sector on industrial energy efficiency, you'll recall. But a lot of that was in response to policy action that governments were taking about a decade ago. Post the Paris Agreement, the issue really went global, and that started to influence shareholders and investors institutionally and multinationals. And then that flowed through to Australia alongside at the same time as society's expectations increased. So corporates who have customers and have brand reputations were taking much more interest. And we found then they were coming to us, whereas in the first 5 years we were going to them.
And how would you characterise, I suppose, the leadership being shown by Australia's corporate sector, say, relevant to leadership being shown by governments here in Australia at the moment?
It ebbs and flows. I think there are many businesses now who acknowledge that business leaders are ahead of national policy, particularly around net zero emissions. But at the state level, state governments were committing to net zero emissions by 2050 very soon after the Paris Agreement, whereas businesses were not there yet then. So there's a to and a fro involved in it, and different layers, of course, on both.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's dive into the topic of today's discussion, which is, of course, Decarbonisation Futures. But before we get into the detail of this excellent report, I thought it might be worthwhile reflecting on the task at hand. And I know that all of us have been thinking about this for a long time, but nevertheless, you sort of have those pivotal moments and those refreshing moments as we encounter new information and hit a new milestone in our own professional journeys. And I remember we were both on stage at All Energy Australia back in October last year, and you just returned from the Climate Action Summit in New York. And if I recall how you were in your public comments and also talking to you sort of around that, you were really affected by your trip to New York and what you were hearing there. And I just thought, before we dive into the detail of the report, it might be interesting for you to share some of your reflections from that recent international trip.
Sure. Yeah, I remember it vividly, even though October now is half a year ago and half a world ago, really.
Yep.
It was the first UN Climate Action Summit, actually. There's been many UN climate meetings, but this was a deliberate meeting called by the Secretary General in the lead up to the 5-year post-Paris UN climate meeting. And it was deliberately intended to try and catalyse an increase in climate action. And so to coincide with it, the UN commissioned an update of the science. And the IPCC had a year earlier done its first study of the 1.5 degree scenario, whereas most of the Paris analysis had been around the 2 degrees scenario. And that analysis was fed into a tracking progress type report of where are we at and where are emissions headed, and it's called United in Science. And that is one of the most accessible reports. I recommend just Google that and read the front page of it. And it was being in the room with those scientists who presented it during that week that really got to me, alongside being in New York with all the global leaders in our sector. And I'll talk about both of those just briefly. The science was terrifying, actually. It confirmed that climate impacts were hitting harder and sooner than predicted a decade ago, and that the world, as we know, is headed for 3 to 4 degrees, not well under 2. And so the report, which was called United in Science, gathered up what increase in action was called for and calculated that it's in fact a 5-fold increase in climate action that's needed, and that in the next decade to 2030, so 2020 now to 2030, emissions must halve worldwide, yet they are still rising. To support that, this study of comparing 1.5 and 2, so we're not on track, but what are we trying to get on track towards? It was really starkly illustrated the exponential difference between staying under 2 degrees or actually achieving 1.5. Our research shows in time that difference is about a decade. You've got to go about a decade faster in terms of reaching net zero before 2050. But on the science, it's fundamental. Like at 2 degrees, coral reefs do not survive. It's ecosystem collapse. But at 1.5, they have enough years where they're not bleached that they can recover. Like some really fundamental differences, and exponential growth, like tens of millions of more people exposed to drought and food security risks and water shortage in a 2 degree scenario compared to 1.5. So that really brought home the danger of going too slow, and put the maths around what does going faster mean. And it means 5-fold increase and halving emissions this decade. So I came home armed with those new statistics and the feeling of that, and they coined this phrase, the new Moore's law for carbon, which is that emissions should halve this decade and every decade thereafter, the 2030s and the 2040s, to reach net zero by 2050. So that I found was really compelling. And then the other emotional reaction was being in New York at the centre of that meeting. The whole nation's leaders were there for the UN Secretary General's meeting, but also the climate movement were there, global peers of mine and many other businesses. To that point about businesses stepping up, there were more businesses joining alliances and collaborations and making their own commitments to increased action. But around that, there was not enough government increase from any national government. And that's what the UN had hoped to catalyse. So again, there were mixed emotions that in one sense our club was growing and there was ambition and greater collaborations and coalitions. But on the other hand, some of the underlying policy owners weren't stepping up yet. So, intense range of highs and lows during that week.
Yeah, sure. You're making me think about the Climate Action Summit that took place in San Francisco, which I attended in 2018. So I think what happened was that Governor Jerry Brown, he was in his last few months of his governorship, and he decided to hold this global summit. And I think at that time it wasn't being held under the UN auspices. It was kind of a more informal collaboration between particularly US states and also some of the big businesses that engage in that front. And to be frank, I think it was probably an opportunity for Governor Brown to stick his thumb in the eye of Trump and really show that the states were leading, and to remind the world that the states were leading. And for me, Anna, that 2018 event and being in San Francisco was more inspiring. I didn't come back as I could see almost when I was talking to you last year, sort of the profound concern in your eyes coming back from that event. My feeling coming out of the 2018 one was more inspirational, and I working in this space over a long period of time, it can wear you down. There's two steps forward and one step back is kind of the name of game in energy and climate work in an Australian context. And being in San Francisco, seeing businesses stepping up in that event as well, there was a real push for businesses to, as you say, make that net zero commitment associated with that event, and just be exposed to, as you say, our peers from around the world was fantastic.
That's right. I also found that emotional energy quite energising by the time I'd got home and processed it. And so within 2 months of that, we had put to our board at ClimateWorks, coinciding again with our 10-year anniversary, a new 10-year strategy for the decade ahead. And it was focused on exponential change, because that's the task. And we have always followed what the science required. And so we've now got an entire integrated approach focused on system change, actually understanding the energy system as a whole, food and land systems, cities and urban infrastructure systems, and finance and government alongside that, and focusing on system change interventions and making sure that our energies are directed to those, if you like, biggest bang for buck type tipping points. In the past, we might have had more time for the incremental improvements.
Yep.
And we've reorganised ourselves now to focus on system transformation, and we have channeled that energy into a very focused direction now. So
when your report refers to that tagline, the transformational decade, is that what you're talking about?
Yes. We've that language again is used by the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that we work closely with, about 1,000 universities around the world. And it looks at those systems and identifies that it's more than incremental improvement. It's a transformation. And that when you look at it holistically, what we found now is the technology can allow us to leapfrog straight to the transformed state. So it's really about doing the backcasting of understanding what is the transformed state. For example, decarbonised electricity, and start there and then work back to where we are today. Which is a different mindset from beginning where we are today and chipping away at the challenge. And so that's where the transformation language is really helpful. And the other reason for that language is the scale of action. The exponential effort, not just in thinking, but in halving worldwide emissions when they're still rising, that's a transformational step up in terms of scale of action too.
Well, it's probably a good opportunity to dive into the report itself. And firstly, congratulations to you and especially your team, who have obviously put their heart and soul into this. And ClimateWorks has always been known for the quality of its research and also the quality of its communication, I'd say. I think that there's plenty of reports out there that have all kinds of wonderful information, but what you guys excel in is actually doing the next bit and actually communicating that work really well. So congratulations for that, but I think you really stepped up. Like this report is so sharp and so clear And I just think that you've got an awful lot to be proud of. And as a partner of ClimateWorks, we want to do everything we can at the Energy Efficiency Council to get that message out. One of the things I really liked in terms of that communications piece was real clarity on the sectors of the economy where we have the technology, we just need to get on with it, versus sectors of the economy where we have some of the answers, but there's also a bunch of stuff that we need to work out. So in terms of the two sectors you've highlighted as, let's get on with it, guys, electricity and buildings, do you want me to step our listeners through what's happening in both of those sectors, what's already been achieved, and how we need to ramp up our efforts in electricity and buildings to bank some wins as soon as we possibly can?
Yes, happy to. And for the benefit of those who haven't are not familiar with the work, we use a 4 pillars framework of decarbonisation and look at all the 5 sectors where emissions are created and can be abated. And those 5 sectors are buildings, electricity, transport, industry, and agriculture. And the 4 pillars are energy efficiency, renewable electricity, fuel switch, and sequestration or removal of non-energy emissions. That has been a really helpful matrix, the 4x5, the 4 pillars across the 5 sectors. And so when you ask, Luke, what's happening in each and what's required in each, we then studied all the technologies that can reduce emissions across the 4x5. And we grouped those technologies into mature, demonstrated, or emerging. And in buildings, we found mature and demonstrated are already there, but there's certainly good emerging stuff, but actually the scale of action that's needed is possible already with the mature and demonstrated technology that I know your listeners will be well familiar with. The obvious energy efficiency measures in buildings, the insulation, the draft ceiling, the design, the windows, the lighting, the optimisation of the equipment and so on, the smart systems and the controls. And then the electrification, the second pillar, switching from gas to renewables, for example. So installing heat pumps commercially and residentially, induction cooking, for example. All of that is now available with mature technologies. But those technologies are not the default norm in every sector, and they are not yet installed in a widespread way. So we measured what could be achieved if policy and business and technological improvement all pulled together in the same direction. And we showed massive energy savings possible in buildings through a combination of electrification, because electricity is a more efficient fuel than gas in particular, and through the energy efficiency, so that over the 30 years from now to 2050, which was our study period, the building stock doubles, yet our energy use in all the scenarios, it's possible to hold the use of the volume of electricity flat while the building stock is doubling by electrifying and improving the energy efficiency technologies. So that's just a quick snapshot of the buildings chapter.
Can I just pause there, Anna? Because one of the things that is an active discussion among, I guess, the organisations we work with, as well as within the Energy Efficiency Council membership in that whole electrification space, is the role of hydrogen. There's obviously a lot of excitement around hydrogen. My experience in Australia is that we tend to fixate on the technology every 12 to 18 months, and anybody wants to talk about it. We've been through that phase with renewables and batteries and pumped hydro, and hydrogen is the technology of the moment, and they all have their role. But in my view at least, all of them need to be integrated and working together. But the specific question I have is around the role of hydrogen in the building space and the existing gas networks, whether you're talking about blended hydrogen in the short term or indeed the visions that some have for a hydrogen-focused transition to gas system. How are you thinking about that in the context of the transition in the building space?
Yeah, great question. Firstly, a caveat on the hydrogen analysis in this report. This report was 2 years in the making, and we began this report before the National Hydrogen Strategy was underway, and the data available then was a lot less. So this is not the place to look for detailed analysis on hydrogen. There is much more recent work, and you'll see in our study, we refer to the industry, particularly in the industry chapter and the transport chapter. We've looked a little bit at hydrogen for transport in fuel cells, and we show that where biofuels or syngas is proposed, hydrogen can play a role, but we haven't been able to study that in depth. But there is new data on the way through a multitude of hydrogen programs, as you note, Luke, that have really taken off in the last year and a bit. I have a slightly different take to you on that. When you said the sector likes to focus in on new technologies, in my view, hydrogen is different. Hydrogen is really worth investing in, because for Australia, it also provides a solution to the export problem. That Australia's climate debate has been challenging because we export fossil fuels. Australia has the potential to export green hydrogen to nations who will need clean energy, and the planet needs a clean energy system. So hydrogen is not just a substitute for our domestic emissions, but is also a major export opportunity and substitute for a current major source of export income. And that's really important for the national progress on this. Our report looked only at domestic emissions, so the export discussion is happening in other programs, one of which we're looking now at industry with a heavy industry program and looking at that very directly. So to your more direct question on hydrogen in the gas network, we haven't studied that closely, and it is being looked at not just in Australia, and I know Energy Networks Association has looked at it in some detail. The UK are looking at it very closely, of course, and there are many other jurisdictions where maintaining the gas network is potentially the first preference for the seasonal energy load that they share. In Australia's case, we've found that it's the huge improvements in renewable electricity costs and the equipment that can electrify. We have found that for new builds, you can leapfrog straight to electricity. So really then the question for the gas network is for a residential retrofit and also commercial and industrial. And I know that analysis is happening elsewhere.
And I think it's fair to say that the focus that you have in this report, particularly around buildings, around mature technologies that are ready to roll, is something to consider when considering the relative pathways that we have to take in electrification versus a transition to hydrogen in the residential space.
I've just been looking at some of the questions on this. People are really engaged, which is terrific. But Andy and Luke, I'm going to leave you to curate the Q&A, because I can see it popping up on my screen there, and you guide me on the questions that you want me to respond to. Thanks.
We absolutely will, Anna. All right, well, let's press pause on buildings and go to that other sector that you highlighted as being ready to roll, electricity. That's
right. And our research showed what we used CSIRO and the energy team to illustrate what can the Australian electricity network nationally, so the NEM plus all states, how quickly can it decarbonise. And you'll see in the benchmarks for 2030 that essentially that analysis shows that it's possible in the next decade for the renewables share to be at around 3/4 in Australia, so in the 70s to 79%. Interestingly, today, Luke, some of your listeners may have read that AEMO has a new study out, the Renewable Integration Study, and it confirms that Australia has the technical capacity to hit that 3/4%, 75% share in the next 5 years in the NEM. And our research had achieving that in the next 10. So the market operator is today confirming the ambition that our analysis that we did with CSIRO confirmed is achievable in Australia. it's a huge amount of work, but it is absolutely achievable with the technology that we have today. We looked at a range of, again, measures, not just the demand management side, of course, but the integration side and storage. And obviously storage is a combination of battery, large and small, also solar thermal and pumped hydro. So our analysis, which uses the CSIRO modelling capability, shows a reliance on a variety of combination of storage to stabilise the supply during that rapid period of decarbonisation. And really the only difference between the three scenarios was how quickly was coal phased out. And you'll see that in all the scenarios that occurs between 2025 and 2035.
Which, if you look at the natural life of some of the aging coal-fired assets that are still in the system, this is a pressing question. I mean, we had a mini national crisis over the last year or so, sort of contemplating the future of that old clunker Liddell. But that's nothing when you look at some of the capacity that's going to need to be either replaced or refurbished or taken off the network in that period between 2025 and 2035. The only question is what we replace it with.
That's right, and our analysis shows that there is more than enough feasible technology options for Australia to do that replacement in that coming decade. And it's certainly a rapid build out, and I think AEMO's report today highlights really clearly that will require investment in transmission, and it will require improvement in the market management tools that the market operator has available to it to manage the particularly distributed energy resources. But it's really heartening to see that the Australian Energy Market Operator has confidence that we do have the technical capability. And if you're looking for the roadmap on how to achieve that, reading today's report from AEMO is a really good place to start.
Thanks, Anna. And we'll look for that report and drop it into the show notes for this podcast. So moving on to industry, and I guess when we talk industry, shall we unpack that? We're talking manufacturing and resources, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Industry includes for us all of the sectors that aren't transport, buildings, electricity or agriculture, so it includes waste as well. But that's a smaller share overall.
So a hugely diverse space, but I guess you've run the numbers and feel comfortable sort of broadly characterising the challenge that is faced in the industrial sector in Australia?
That's right. So it is a very important sector. Industry produces nearly half of Australia's emissions, and a significant portion of those are non-energy sources. So we've just had the discussion about electricity. But in industry, we also have to look at non-electricity or non-energy emissions as well, and that is process emissions. So again, we looked at the 4 pillars and mature and demonstrated and emerging technologies, and there is a lot that's in the mature and demonstrated space, and obviously emerging. So in energy efficiency, you'd be well familiar with the importance of process design and equipment upgrades, and also now using the digital opportunity for artificial intelligence and automation. We also looked a lot at substitution. So in particular, the circular economy principles and material substitution. So that's everything from metal recycling and plastics recycling, but also looking at, for example, cross-laminated timber instead of steel. And we have found, 10-storey high buildings in Brisbane already using timber instead of steel. Also in the circular economy principles, things like 3D printing are a demonstrated technology that can also help reduce emissions. In the electrification pillar, there are demonstrated mine sites already that are using electric conveyors to replace, for example, diesel trucks. And in steelmaking, there is the electric arc furnace approach. Again, you're taking an electrification approach which helps reduce. And then a is another solution available, not commercial, but also at industrial scale. And then finally, for other fuels, it's important that we looked at bioenergy, solar thermal, potentially geothermal, and also hydrogen. And as I said, hydrogen is an enormous opportunity to explore further, and that will be done in other work. So We looked at fuel switching and electrification that can help most industrial processes reach zero emissions. And that's a big shift from even 5 years ago when we last looked at that. Then you need to do a bit more work to target process and what's called fugitive emissions. So coal mining, for example, ventilation air, methane oxidation, thinking about refrigerants, fugitive emissions from oil and gas, which really requires CCS. You just have to capture those emissions that would otherwise escape. That's the fugitive term. And similarly in metals, there are process emissions, and that's where hydrogen is an opportunity, not just as an energy source, but as a direct reduction for making steel and using it in replace of coke and coal. And I know that there's significant studies underway on that, and they're really promising for Australia. So looking at what are the other sources of process emissions and what are the substitutes for those that go beyond the energy space. So we looked at all of those. You're right, it's quite a diverse sector, and carbon capture and storage we found would be required, particularly for oil and gas, where there are those extraction emissions that escape, and also for a little bit of the process emissions in chemicals and minerals. There are, though, in this sector, still residual emissions. So when we look at getting to zero emissions in every sector, we find buildings can, electricity can. We find, however, that agriculture and industry at the moment still need further technological breakthroughs to achieve actual zero emissions. And so what we found was using today's evidence of technology, we can dramatically reduce emissions, like by 90%. In many of the sectors in industry, but the last 10% would still need some offsetting, which we assume could be done by carbon forestry until that buys time, basically, until further technological breakthroughs could eliminate the last 10%.
So just on that, Anna, do you think about the end point in terms of net zero emissions as that being an absolute sort of goal that we need to meet in each sector of the economy, or is that an economy-wide target? And in fact, what we're tracking towards is something more like low, zero, or negative emissions in each sector of the Australian economy that sort of equals out at net zero emissions.
Yeah, great question. And there are a great number of studies around the negative emissions, like sort of catching up, removing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than might be emitted in a year in order to catch up some overshoot from past years. One of our scenarios shows a simplified view of that using carbon forestry, but it's important to remember that all of this is it's a combination of time across time and the stock of emissions in total. And those temperature limits are breached once the stock of emissions in the atmosphere exceeds a volume that tips the temperature above 1.5 degrees or 2. The race against time is where something like carbon forestry is helpful and where net zero comes in. But it can't go on forever because there isn't limitless land, obviously. And so that's where other reports, not this one, have looked at BECCS, such as bioenergy with CCS, carbon capture and storage, which is to look at how could one area of land, plant trees, chop them down, capture the emissions from burning the wood as a fuel and then replant so that you could sort of get recycling of that land. We haven't studied that in detail, but I'm trying to illustrate that for as long as you're not at absolute zero and you're relying on nature-based solutions, for example, tree planting, every single year that residual 10% emits, you'll need a new volume of land for the tree planting to capture that new annual 10% extra. So the way we look at it is that it's a chance to buy yourself time. And we've been delighted in the decade we've been working on this, how much technology has moved. Really, our first report 10 years ago had solar PV rooftop off the charts of commercial viability. It was not in realm. Mm-hmm. And it's really helpful to remember that was 10 years ago. And we wrote it and we won a national prize for that report. Like, we weren't wrong then. 5 years ago, Similarly, electric aviation, for example, was not in contention for a decarbonisation pathway. And now there are electric planes flying passengers now, not yet jumbo jets, but trying to show that each decade we see large leaps in technology improvement. And so when we show in our charts, you'll see these wedges diagrams where the residual emissions look like they continue flat forever at a sort of, 10 to 20% share. That's not a declaration that it should continue flat forever, but rather that the next decade of technological innovation has the job of working out how to eliminate that ongoing residual tail of emissions, and that each decade we do better. And what we found is this report, compared to 5 years earlier when we last did our scenarios of deep decarbonisation, the residual tail this time is much smaller. So we would hope that in 5 years from now, that residual tail shrinks even. And so your question of are you aiming for actual zero or net, is that always the goal is actual zero, and the net zero concept is the timing game to buy ourselves time by offsetting what we can't eliminate until we work out how to eliminate it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have two sectors in the framework of your report to cover off, and we've gone long on the first three, so we may need to race through agriculture and transport, but two obviously incredibly important sectors. But can you give me the takeout from those two parts of your report too?
Sure, and they're quite different stories, obviously. But in transport, it's a little similar to buildings, where electrification is the theme. It takes a little longer in transport because of the lifetime of cars and the time it takes to transition a fleet. But we show that transport can also reach net zero or very close to zero in all the scenarios that we've studied, and that basically oil use is replaced with a combination of electricity and either bioenergy or hydrogen. And again, there's a variety of different combinations that we show in the report across that. And it's important that with transport that we get moving. Essentially, the next decade, we have to paddle really hard just to stay flat, if you like. That to keep transport emissions from not rising, we need to do a great deal of work. And then in the latter half of the 2020s, it's envisaged that the cost effectiveness of the electric vehicles takes over, and then the overall emissions of the vehicle fleet can drop dramatically. I might move quickly to agriculture rather than spend more time on transport. There's obviously a lot more detail in the report, but I think the short message is the technology is already there. It's about getting it installed, and in thinking about the transport system as a whole, that includes the infrastructure that can support an electric vehicle fleet, and also infrastructure for mass mobility. So that's public transport and other modes of ride sharing and using software. So there's quite a lot of sophistication in transport system design that can play a real role on the demand management side when we think about the four pillars of efficiency and then electrification and then the fuel switch. In agriculture, electrification plays a part in relation to the equipment used on farm. And then the other big source of emissions is obviously the livestock. And so we show quite a bit of detail in what you can do to reduce those energy emissions. And then in agriculture, looking at livestock and grains, if you like, and non-energy. And so there's precision agriculture, fertiliser management, and efficiency on farm is applicable to both the grains and livestock agriculture, which really plays a great role in reducing emissions. And then looking at livestock itself, there's some really interesting emerging and demonstrated technologies around helping address what's called enteric fermentation, which is the way cattle digest food, and that they create methane by burping, essentially. So you can adjust the way they're fed, and you can potentially use a anti-methane vaccine, which we know is proven, but what's not yet proven is how to deliver it at a widespread scale. And we show that if we can crack that nut in terms of making that commercially available, agricultural emissions could halve nationally. That's 40 million tonnes of emissions saved, while still having a livestock industry and and agriculture sector that contributes to the Australian economy as it does today. So some really interesting technology developments that we should absolutely invest in because they can create dramatic emissions savings. They don't, however, eliminate all emissions. And so again, there is a residual tail of emissions. And we look again at nature-based solutions and carbon forestry, which can be integrated on farm or of course be in separate dedicated plantations.
So Anna, thank you for taking us through all of those 5 sectors. And the things that strikes me or reinforces to me is that the really sort of bespoke stories, the really tailored stories and trajectories in each part of the economy. And it's incumbent on all of us that are working in this space to be thinking very carefully, particularly from a policy perspective, of the different technologies, the different challenges and opportunities in each of those sectors, and really importantly, the different stakeholders and businesses and individuals that we need to engage in all of those spaces. So what often the Energy Efficiency Council and ClimateWorks and others kind of end up talking about this big economy-wide narrative, need to often drop down into and to do the storytelling in different parts of the economy. But then we need to work out how to engage everybody in this journey. But it's very specific conversations with each parts of those sectors. Do you want to just comment on that?
You're absolutely right. And Australia's, if you like, political debate has been consumed by the electricity debate largely. And of course, that export challenge of what can we export if we're not exporting coal and gas. And we have at ClimateWorks have repeatedly produced economy-wide analysis tracking progress and these pathways to show that there are emissions in all 5 sectors. And electricity is absolutely critical to enabling decarbonisation in buildings and transport and some of industry, but it doesn't do the whole job. And so it's, as you say, each sector, any sector would limit our ability to achieve net zero emissions if it doesn't have its own focus. And you're right, each sector's needs and stakeholders are different, and also so are the policy solutions. As you know, with energy efficiency, a price incentive doesn't do the job. And similarly, the agricultural incentives and industry are quite different. Now also, we're seeing some themes that are common across all sectors include the need for alliances, and that actually it's not one sector often can't solve their own sector alone. And that can be that sometimes government can't do it without business, or an industry sometimes needs government there for policy or for shared infrastructure. So we are seeing some common themes around the need for that collaboration, and there's a common approach across many of the sectors. But you're dead right, Luke, that the emissions challenge is a multi-sector challenge, and we need an equal level of effort in all the sectors. And we hope that our report helps bring to life what that challenge is in every sector, and that the solutions are there in every sector. I mean, that's what was really heartening in this work, is that, as I said, that residual tail got smaller, that in every sector there were net zero emissions alternatives available now and commercially available. Not necessarily widespread though. And so that's really the challenge, is how do you go from proven to widely adopted? And that is indeed a common challenge across all the 5 sectors that we looked at.
Thank you, Anna. And for the benefits of those listeners at home, every episode of First Fuel is broadcast live, as indeed this one is being broadcast live, and there's a whole bunch of people watching as we're recording and contributing questions in the chat. If you want to tune in for a future broadcast of First Fuel, you can visit eec.org.au/podcast. But I'm very keen, Anna, to start addressing some of the questions that have been lobbed into the chat. And there's one which is a burning one and very topical at the moment, which is, of course, around the issue on stimulus. There's stimulus packages obviously being rolled out and contemplated by governments around the world, including here in Australia. And I note that in terms of your public presentation of Decarbonisation Futures, you've been very keen to emphasise the opportunity for a win-win to drive economic growth on the other side of this crisis, to retain and create jobs, but of course also to set our economy on a pathway towards decarbonisation. I suppose, could you expand on how your thinking has evolved post COVID-19, but also what the response to that advocacy has been?
Sure. Yes, you're right, Luke. We obviously were working on this for nearly 2 years and just completing the graphic design of it when lockdown began. So when we then looked at it with those eyes of actually, what does this mean if we're in the need for stimulus and economic recovery, we found actually huge alignment between the recommendations that, as I was just summarising earlier, across all the 5 sectors, there are proven technologies that get us to zero emissions, but they're not yet widely adopted or deployed, if you like. So our recommendations in the report were that we need to accelerate the deployment of the technologies in all the sectors. That means bringing forward investment in equipment and technology that's already available. That fits the criteria of the stimulus package. That's the shovel-ready type discussion that economists are often saying is incentivise or subsidise or support people to be able to invest in their local economy, buy the equipment, improve their businesses. So I know you'll know this from your energy efficiency expertise, that equipment upgrades, for example, is a readily available solution that can help lower energy bills for people, make homes more comfortable, make businesses more productive, and create that stimulus effect of the purchase, the installation, the delivery of the equipment, and you don't need to wait for it to be invented. So we found a really strong theme that in every single one of our sectors, that was the core recommendation, was accelerate the mature and the demonstrated technologies. Of course, we also said you've got to pull through the emerging, and so there still is a need to look to the future. And I know you asked about what's the response been, and it's been not quite a month since we published this work. And in that month, you'll note the public narrative has moved a bit from we're in the emergency phase to what's the economy we want to rebuild when we come out of this. So we have found that our report, again, does take both lenses. There is the urgent, bring forward that equipment upgrade at every purchase opportunity. That should not be an opportunity missed to leapfrog straight to the zero emission solution. Yet at the same time, have an eye on the next decade and build in the resilience of our economy to be zero emissions ready. So are those emerging technologies going to be ready when we need them at the back end of this decade? And so that means increased investment in green innovation, certainly more effort in the renewable hydrogen and green hydrogen and ammonia industry development that we discussed earlier, and the industries that green hydrogen can develop, such as green steel and aluminium. We found also that the 4 pillars approach that I've talked about, we've talked about 5 sectors and 4 pillars of decarbonisation: energy efficiency or the demand management, renewable electricity, electrification and fuel switch, and then the non-energy emissions or nature-based solutions. In all of those, there are stimulus-friendly solutions. The energy efficiency space obviously has the opportunity for retrofit residential buildings and commercial buildings. And I know you know and have published on the jobs benefits of this. They are local jobs and they help bring down energy bills. Similarly, in the longer term, electricity infrastructure and that importance of electrification requires investment in transmission, in grid management, and the infrastructure to cope with electrification, such as EV charging and the public transport and mobility measures. So again, using the 4 pillars approach, we can look at the short-term and the longer-term economic recovery measures that helps set us up to have an economy that is more resilient to that other global crisis that hasn't gone away during the pandemic crisis, that being rising temperatures and climate change.
And of course, Anna, it would be ridiculous for us to get through this hour together without mentioning the bushfire crisis, which seems so long ago now, but absolutely devastated large swathes of rural Australia. And I don't know about you, but I've got whiplash with how many times the fundamentals of the politics of energy and climate has changed in the last 6 months. It's gone from an afterthought to a burning concern, to use a very bad pun, to something which is a little bit back on the back burner. Obviously, being thought about in the context of economic recovery and stimulus, but understandably one issue which is vying for attention among a whole bunch of other issues that are dominating the public consciousness. We have a couple of questions in the chat on bioenergy and biofuels, one in relationship to the opportunity to convert coal-fired power stations, but also just considering the role of biofuels in the broader transition to 100% renewables. Did you want to address that question, Anna?
Yes, and this is where the concept of exponential transformation that we discussed at the very start of this session comes in, and having your end state in mind when you plan what it is you do next. So with biofuels, we've looked at the end state in mind, and we found that there is a need for biofuels, but it's most urgently likely to be needed for very long haul transport that can't be done by electricity. And that's mostly very large aviation and shipping, which could be delivered through hydrogen and ammonia. And long haul freight looks like it might be a combination potentially of hydrogen fuel cells. So with biofuels, bioenergy is definitely needed, most likely for aviation and possibly for some of the other long haul. One of your questioners asked, what about biomass, for example, for coal-fired power stations, bioenergy in that realm? And this is where leapfrog comes in. Our analysis shows that renewables has already leapfrogged that technology, and we can go straight to the zero emissions solution. And if we acknowledge that biofuels, like all nature-based solutions, has physical limits on it, and it's therefore finite, then the highest value use is where our scenarios drew us, and that's where aviation is likely to be the highest value buyer of biofuels, and producing electricity is more likely to be effectively done with renewable electricity than a bioenergy or biomass solution.
And finally, Anna, there's a couple of questions in the chat around the fact that many of these solutions that you're highlighting, we've known about for a long time. They would have been talked about in early ClimateWorks reports. Obviously, we're getting much better at implementing them. Cost curves are coming down. We've got a much clearer sense of the pathways, but the fundamental question remains about how we actually supercharge action in this space. I think your report is focused on solutions more so than policy levers. I think that's fair to say. But I know you have opinions in this space. Well, what would your advice be to state and federal governments that are inspired by your report? What are the sort of top 2 or 3 things that you would be encouraging them to do coming out of the current crisis? Immediate measures, looking ahead across the next 5 or 10 years. I know that we have ministers around the country that are passionate about this space and want to make a difference. What would you say to them?
Great question, and the short answer is it's a long answer, so work with us, because obviously there's not one thing. The state governments have done the right thing by set that long-term goal. Now the question that we will also invest our deep time in is implementation pathways, right? So remembering the 5 sectors and the 4 pillars, that's actually really fundamental to making sure none of it gets overlooked. There are some institutional supports that really help those targets and procurement expectations and standards. So setting net zero into all government procurement. We know now the technology is there, so government can be a pull-through buyer in all of those sectors. That's a sort of a short-term action that's available right now. We'll do the work in the coming weeks and months to analyse which ones of those are stimulus friendly in relation to jobs. Certainly in relation to net zero emissions, we know we need it all. The other institutional supports is goal-oriented investment. So things like setting renewable energy targets and investing to deliver those things like what the CFC and ARENA can do, setting up hydrogen development goals, are institutional scale support. Then at the more sector level, some other fundamentals that we've learned is that innovation matters, and that the sectors that still need solutions need increased innovation investment. And even the Reserve Bank has modelled that Australia has dropped down the league tables in what we spend as a share of corporate investment and GDP investment in innovation. So we've got to bring that up if we care about climate, because climate depends on innovation for those residual emissions. And the final thing is deployment. All the data shows that costs come down when deployment goes up. So doing whatever you can do, whether it's mandate that the zero emissions option is the only option that can be deployed, whether it's set best practice requirements, procurement standards, or whether it's underwriting or purchasing the desired zero emissions solutions. Everything that government can do to pull through and require increased deployment, we find has outsized benefit, because the rest of the market then gets its own momentum and doesn't necessarily need the government stimulus after that.
It's a great space to finish in, looking ahead to what we can do practically in this space. Anna, for those listeners that are inspired to go read the report or engage further with ClimateWorks, where should they go?
Our website has all of these reports and slides online, and that is at climateworksaustralia.org.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Anna. I appreciate your generosity and the ongoing partnership that we have. As I say, we're a deep believer in your work, and we'll be doing whatever we can to get the message out. So good luck as you're having conversations and continuing to have these conversations over the coming weeks and months.
Thank you very much.
So that wraps up this first episode of First Fuel. If you have comments or feedback, you can hit me up on Twitter at Luke Menzel, LUKEMENZEL, or email us at firstfuel@eec.org.au. Make sure you catch our next episode, because we'll be dialing Paris to talk to the International Energy Agency's Head of Energy Efficiency, Dr. Brian Motherway, who, like Anna, has been talking a lot about the role of energy efficiency and the broader clean energy transition in the post-COVID-19 stimulus space. As I said, every episode of First Fuel is broadcast as it's recorded, so you can jump on Zoom, listen in live, and even contribute questions in the chat. As our webinar participants today can attest, I don't guarantee I'll ask your question, but it's absolutely worth a shot. For a full listing of upcoming recording times, as I said, visit eec.org.au/podcasts. But for now, it's goodbye from us, and we'll catch you in a couple of weeks.